There are 19.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the final webinar in the City and County of Denver webinar series. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be sent out to all attendees. My name is Erica DeLello and I'm a project manager for NORESCO. But just as a heads up, I have muted everyone's lines to reduce background noise, but we do want to encourage questions, so please use the chat function and I'll let our presenter know at the end. The Colorado Energy Office is sponsoring these trainings, and to enable us to keep providing them, I will be sending out a short survey at the end of the presentation. Through this survey, you'll also be able to sign up for AIA and IECC continuing education credits. To start us off, we have Christy Collins here to provide us with an overview of Denver's community goals and ongoing collaboration between the Offices of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency, and Community Planning and Development. So with that, I'll let Christy take it from here.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for coming and making time for this. I am going to go through some slides really quickly just to kind of set up a foundation for why we're still pushing hard on talking about energy and going through the new Denver amendments to IECC. So I think it's important just to acknowledge first that there are a lot of ongoing conversations right now that are really important related to the uncertainty in Denver, related to equity, related to financial considerations, and we are very sensitive and involved in those conversations. We are continuing to push on energy because we view the energy conversation as central to solving the problems related to financial considerations and related to equity. We don't think that they're separate. So as part of Denver's long-term vision and long-term viability, we think we really have to address sustainability and energy. And so we are going to keep pushing forward. So with that said, I'm just starting by putting up this slide that has a bunch of different goals on it that were brought to us by the community. Equity, response to climate change, and affordability kind of top the list, and everything else factors in because they're all intertwined. But those are the three big ones, and we see those three as interconnected. We don't think that we can solve for one without solving for the other two at the same time. So to have a viable community for the long term to be sustainable, we have to be equitable, we have to be affordable. So we have to worry about the environment and we have to worry about energy. We've asked ourselves the question, what does resiliency mean for Denver? And we've come up with a bunch of different risk factors that our community faces, all of which in some way do connect back to energy. And so that connects back to each individual project that we're building. So we're looking at what the opportunities are for each of those projects and how we can affect those projects through our codes so that each one is a positive contributor to Denver's future. Greenhouse gas emissions are central to that. We know that homes and buildings in Denver contribute 63% of Denver's greenhouse gas emissions, and we also know that by 2050, 40% of the buildings that are standing at that time will have been built between now and then. So we know that new buildings matter and that codes matter. And that's not to say that we don't also know that existing buildings matter or that cleaning up the grid matters. Those are two other efforts that our Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency are very actively taking on. We're just not talking about that today because the code doesn't really deal with that directly, but know that that's happening also. So as we focus on new buildings, the existing buildings and the grid are also being worked on. Through our work, we are trying to get to a point where performance is considered from the very beginning of every project when the site is being selected alongside aesthetics. Not that it waits until we're part of the way down the road and we've gotten through most of schematic design or we've fallen in love with what the building's going to look like, but the performance is on the table from the very, very beginning. That's not a new concept. That's something that the AIA tasked our industry with years ago and put into the Code of Ethics. We are just adopting that more strongly in Denver and more actively. We know that regulations can't advance without market advancing at the same time in tandem, and so we know that we just can't pass a bunch of rules and run away. So we have an ongoing dialogue with the community, and this will be an ongoing collaboration. I would say 200 times in a longer version of this presentation that we are doing this in conjunction with the community. It's important to acknowledge the role of the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency in all of the work that we're doing. They do a lot of the work that creates the plans and sets the goals. They existed for years before now. Right now, at the beginning of this year, they got created as a separate office that reports directly to the mayor, but previously they were part of the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment and had their same team as the climate action team. There are 13 people, but they're growing, and the reason why they were broken out as this separate entity is because the community worked in direct conjunction with the mayor to make this happen, because climate matters. So the first thing that the mayor did as a plan that got rolled out, he did 2 years ago now already, which was to roll out the 80 by 50 plan, a commitment on the part of our city to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions 80% below 2005 levels by 2050. That's a really high aspirational goal, and we are working towards making plans that will allow us to achieve that goal. One of those plans is to hit a milestone that is contained in that bigger 80 by 50 plan, which is to get all of our new buildings acting together collectively as zero net energy buildings in Denver by 2035. We have 5 code cycles to get there, and we are writing an implementation plan this year that will set the path so that we can get there, so we're not, flying without a plan. We are going to use the IECC amendments in Denver and also our voluntary green code and the green buildings ordinance to support that work and support our buildings. We're targeting 4 areas. Energy efficiency is an obvious one. Provision of renewable energy is also pretty obvious. Building electrification, getting off of natural gas, is a big one that we can certainly talk more about. Not everybody knows why natural gas is as problematic as it is, but it is problematic. And then grid stability is the 4th piece, because Excel can't get to their goals without our collaboration. So our focus here is on the energy codes, the IECC and associated Denver amendments, our voluntary Denver Green Code, and the Denver Green Buildings Ordinance. We're also working on zoning code updates and updates to our infrastructure guidelines, different regulations that the city has. But we'll just focus on these major pieces and really the Denver amendments to the IECC today, because that's the building focus work. So the big green blob on this graph is the reason why we care so much about the energy codes and the Denver amendments. They have the biggest impact on Denver's overall greenhouse gas emissions and energy use. We like the zero net energy pilots. They show us what can be done. They're super important, but we have to get all of our mainstream buildings together, raising the bar and doing better. So towards that end, the chapter team, the Climate Action and Sustainability and Resiliency team, pursued funding through the Bloomberg American Cities Climate Challenge to help support our efforts to lower greenhouse gas emissions through our buildings and transportation work. That is funding that we've been receiving over the last 2 years, and as part of that, we had the Institute for Market Transformation come out last October to help us look at how we're doing relative to IECC compliance and where are opportunities to improve not only in our plan reviews and in our inspections, but also in the actual buildings that are getting built, what's happening in the field. We are focused on the building outcomes. We know that the design phase matters, the construction phase matters, but ultimately the outcome is what matters the most, right? It doesn't matter how a building is designed if it doesn't perform the way it's intended to perform. We're also focused on continuing to push forward with the Denver amendments to the IECC. This graph shows that the IECC at the national level is not on track with Denver's goals for commercial buildings or for residential buildings. So we need amendments to pull the code in alignment with our goals. That is what we are doing over each code cycle. In this most recent code cycle, for the 2019 Denver amendments, we used it as a learning opportunity. We worked with our committee, we looked at each amendment, we took the ones that the community felt were doable. We got to about 15% better than base code, and that's good, but it wasn't even enough to get us on our trajectory entirely. So we know in future code cycles, we're going to have to work to a goal. We'll have to look at each amendment, but we'll also have to know as a committee that we're working to a goal, and we have to figure out how the community can most painlessly do that and what resources the community needs to get there. We're also using the voluntary green code to introduce to everybody the things that we think are most likely to be considered to be moved into the mandatory code in the next code cycle. So it's not only an opportunity for projects to show exemplary leadership, but it's also an opportunity for everybody else to see what's under conversation and potentially will impact all projects in the mainstream in the next code cycle. So I won't go through any of the specifics related to the IECC amendments because that's what the rest of the 2 hours are for. We know what all of the usual suspects are that we have to target through our amendments. We know that we have 5 code cycles and that as new technologies come out on the market, we're going to respond to that. For the Denver Green Code, we'll do the same thing related to energy, but also to broader holistic sustainability in buildings and sites. So there will be just a broader focus in the Denver Green Code, but there is an embedded energy stress code that's worth looking at in there. Each chapter is specific to a category, so there's a water chapter and an energy chapter and so forth. There are mandatory provisions as well as options. There was a real eye in the development of the Denver Green Code towards making it entirely achievable in Denver. There are 4 compliance pathways. There's a strong leaning towards energy performance because we know how important energy is to meeting Denver's goals. Then the last piece to really talk about is the Green Buildings Ordinance. Any building that complies with the Denver Green Code is automatically considered to be in compliance with the Green Buildings Ordinance. The Green Buildings Ordinance is mandatory for existing as well as new buildings that are larger than 25,000 square feet. It was brought to us by the voters. It was shaped to fit Denver so that it's achievable by mainstream projects, and it modestly increases performance of projects above base code. There's a focus on holistic sustainability, but also on energy efficiency, provision of renewables, and provision of equitable green space throughout the city. We're using the Green Buildings Ordinance to start to have more conversation with our teams about predicted energy use intensity and actual energy use intensity on buildings because we really care about outcomes. The reason why we're doing this is because we want teams to develop an intuition about how their buildings are going to perform. We're seeing from anecdotal just test cases that the predicted energy use of our buildings in Denver is generally a quarter to a half of the actual. So that's a big gap. That's not to say that teams are bad. There are a lot of factors that go into that. It goes from start to finish on a project, including the occupants. So we need to get everybody involved so that our buildings start performing as they're intended to. Ultimately, that's just for the base purpose of supporting the health and welfare of our citizens. So then the last thing to say is just a reminder that we see equity, affordability, and sustainability as one goal. We're collaborating across a broad variety of departments and agencies within the city. The Zero Net Energy New Buildings Implementation Plan, getting all of our buildings to zero net energy by 2035 is one piece, but we're looking at bigger scale pieces at the site level as well, at the planning level. We are looking at existing buildings and neighborhoods and at the whole city level. And we're looking to teams to have more focused conversation on energy, to start looking at metrics, to be accountable and responsible for the performance of projects, and for every member of a project team to get engaged in the conversation about how a building performs. We're also looking beyond the code. So if there are things that you're thinking of that other cities are doing, know that we are probably talking about them because we're talking about a lot of the other pieces that also impact and support higher performing buildings in a community. We're looking at our planning opportunities. We're looking at broad-based sustainability in the design of buildings. And ultimately, we're just looking out to the future and how projects are going to contribute to the future of Denver as a viable community and as a place where residents can live happily and healthily and equitably. So with that, I will say that hopefully many of you already know Keith Fox has stepped up to help lead our teams with IECC. So he's leading our teams internally with our plan reviews and with our inspections. He's also answering questions to the community and providing that expertise. His contact information is here. I collaborate with him on a lot of the IECC-related work and the Denver Green Code work, Green Buildings Ordinance work, and these bigger community goals, so my information is here as well. And with that, I will turn it back over. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy. So now we'll jump into the Denver amendments portion of the presentation, and I'm going to go ahead and pass presenting rights over to you, Kevin. Okay, should be set there. And again, if you do have any questions, please write in the chat throughout, and then we'll answer any questions at the end. Our presenter today is Kevin Perry, and Kevin is the Manager of Engineering Services at NORESCO and a certified commissioning professional with over a decade of experience. He's also a certified plans examiner and inspector for IECC and ASHRAE and sits on the 2018 IECC Energy Task Force. He has provided over 100 trainings on IECC to contractors, architects, engineers, and code officials. So with that, I'll let Kevin take it from here. Kevin, you should have presenting rights to share your screen now.
Okay. Are you seeing my screen by chance?
We are not.
All right. Let me make sure I'm doing this. And we're going to do this screen. And make sure you're seeing the right screen. You seeing the right screen?
Yep.
All right,
yep,
great.
Good.
We'll get started. Thank you. So thanks everybody for joining today. The agenda for today on the IECC topics would be changes from 2015 to 2018. And we would like to cover the amendments that the City and County of Denver add to those 2018 codes. I will also briefly touch on the compliance pathways for the code, only because that provides background information on some of the options and flexibility that the City and County of Denver has allowed you all to have. So anytime, feel free to, as Erica mentioned, chat through the chat box. You know, we encourage conversations, and sometimes I'm not accurate on some of my things, and you know, if you point that out, I am perfectly fine with that. I'm human just like everybody else, and sometimes make mistakes. So the intent of the code, again, just kind of to start off with the presentation, it's to regulate the design and construction of our buildings that we're building here in the City and County of Denver. And what we're trying to do by regulating this, the construction and design, is to conserve energy over the life of the building. As Christy mentioned, you know, the City and County of Denver has very strong aspirations to get to their 20 by 35 goal and 20 by 50 goal. And in order to do that, following the Energy Conservation Code, hopefully we can get there with these amendments. The other part of the intent of the code is to provide flexibility. Some of the most innovative approaches come because of flexibility and thinking outside of the box. So even though that does create opportunities for confusion, the City and County of Denver still wants to provide as much flexibility as possible to not handcuff somebody per se to do a building, you know, one way and have all the buildings be exactly the same. So you'll see throughout the presentation these flexibility options. I'll try to point those out to you all. So people ask, you know, is this code, are the codes and the amendments that the City and County of Denver has adopted, are those just for new buildings? And no, it's not just for new buildings. It's for all buildings, including existing buildings. So if you're doing an addition or alteration or a TI or anything like that, you still have to follow the code and the amendments. For existing buildings, basically an easy way to think about it is if you touch that portion of the building, whatever you touch, then you have to bring that up to code. Now, there are some exceptions to that, you know, based on percentages for lighting and things like that. You know, if you're changing one light fixture, you know, you're not going to be required to bring that one light fixture back up to code. But if you touch a certain percentage of the light fixtures, then you would have to bring all the light fixtures up to code. So just kind of keep that in mind, that it's not just new construction. It's all buildings, whether it's new or existing. So let's jump into the compliance pathways. As you know, there are codes. The governing body is the IECC. Then that kind of spills down to the AHJs, authorities having jurisdictions. And those AHJs are able to amend any part of the code or add to it, you know, add to it, take away whatever they feel is necessary to get to their goals. Being that Colorado is a home rule state, there are several different AHJs throughout the state that change things. Some AHJs keep the code just by the book. Others, like Denver, who have aggressive goals, need to change that to get their goals. So you can see in the different colored boxes, Denver has come up with some items, some flexibility, if you will, and some tracking metrics for them to help everybody get there. So they started with Energize Denver, which is a rating and reporting system for building energy usage. And in that, it has its own flexibility and pathways. Same thing with the Green Building Ordinance. The voters of the City and County of Denver had passed the Green Building Ordinance. And with that Green Building Ordinance came some flexibility options. You have different ways of achieving that ordinance, but again, the city or the voters from the city and county wanted to see something in effect. So the City and County of Denver created a task force to give them options on that. Then you have the Denver Green Code, which is a stretch code, which, if you want to go above and beyond just the baseline of code, City and County of Denver says, all right, go for it. Why not? Let's encourage that. And so that in itself has its own requirements, but it also has some trade-offs, if you will. There was some talk about maybe expedited permitting time or something like that. But, it's always good to go a little bit above and beyond than just base code. So Denver is trying to reward or compensate people for going above and beyond and trying to be leaders out there. And then you have the IECC. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. The IECC is Energy Conservation Code, and it says that you can follow either the IECC pathway or the ASHRAE pathway. And again, talk about flexibility. You now have flexibility in that IECC to follow a couple different pathways. I can get my screen to change, okay. So just a little snippet of what that looks like. You can see this tree starting to grow based on the different amendments or changes to these AHJ requirements. You can see Green Building Ordinance has several of its own. The IECC has ASHRAE. And then if you can go further out, I didn't put everything in here, but you can see the tree starting to get pretty wide pretty quick. There's definitely different pathways. So this is what trips people up quite a bit. We want to make sure that no one intentionally tries to not follow the code. But I think where we get tripped up is there are so many pathways that it's hard to keep straight what pathways we're following and making sure we hit everything that's required. So the good thing with the City and County of Denver and their plans reviewers is that they only have to remember Denver and what Denver amendments are. The not so good thing about the rest of the architectural community is they'll have to remember all 300 AHJ's amendments, because they design in, several different cities and counties and things like that. So it's a little bit more tricky for them. And just keeping things straight is hard when you have more options. So just real quick, on the Green Building Ordinance, we're not talking about that today, but you need to know some of this because it affects some architectural items in the code. So here are the pathways. You have to have a cool roof plus one of those 7 options. Then you can see you can have a combo option, which breaks down even further. But really what we're interested in and trying to point out here is the difference between the IECC, which is what we're talking about today, and the Green Building Ordinance. So you'll see here on the top of the page for roof reflectance and emittance options. The Solar Reflectance Index, SRI, getting tied up there. These top two tables here, or top table, 2 lines, are the IECC requirements. Now, if you go down to this table, these are the Green Building Ordinance requirements. So you can see they don't quite line up with each other. So what you'll have to do is pick the most stringent to meet both requirements in actuality. Denver didn't do this on purpose. It just so happened this way. I think for the most part, Denver and their task force tried to line everything up as best as possible. But this is one item when you're looking at your roof SRI that will be a little bit different, could be a little bit different, I should say, on that. Now, if you look at ASHRAE versus this, ASHRAE doesn't have any requirements for an SRI. So just keep that in mind if you're following the IECC pathway that allows you to follow ASHRAE. Then you don't have to follow any SRI requirements besides the Green Building Ordinance. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your design or looking at plans when they come into your office for plans review. So methods of compliance, in the IECC, there are 4 different ways to comply with this. I'm a visual person, so I'll just break it out here. They have to clearly be marked on the set of plans. And the thing with new buildings is that whatever pathway is selected, that pathway then has to be followed for the rest of the life of that building. So say a building comes in for permit for core and shell, and they pick the ASHRAE Appendix G pathway. They then, for the rest of the life of that building, anytime they pull a permit, would have to follow Appendix G, the ASHRAE Appendix G pathway. They can't jump over to, say, IECC or even ASHRAE prescriptive pathway. They have to follow the same pathway for the life of that building. And the reason for that is that not every pathway is created equal in terms of energy savings or energy consumption. And so if you start to mix and match these pathways, the building energy use or conservation of energy starts to go out the window. You sometimes might be doing something better, but in the overall building might be taking a hit in energy consumption. So that's why we're going to, or City and County of Denver is going to require that the same pathway be followed for the life of the building. So you can see there's 2 pathways here at the top, either ASHRAE 90.1 or IECC 2018. And then with those, these are what I call the 4 pathways. You got prescriptive performance under IECC, and then you have Appendix G and prescriptive under ASHRAE. So that's what I call the 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And with those, you then have mandatory sections to follow no matter what. So no matter which pathway you follow, you're not getting out of some of these mandatory sections. And we're going to cover those a little bit today, along with the changes that were made from last code cycle to this one. So one of the things that I want to point out that is different, this is the base code right here, 2018 IECC. It says that if you're following the prescriptive pathway, you'll have to pick one of these additional energy efficiency package options in Section 406. And what Denver's amended, they said you're actually going to have to pick 2 of these options instead of pick 1. So we'll go through those, but just know that's a change to the Denver amendments. Another change on IECC is if you're doing a model, your model has to be 15% better than baseline. That's base code. Well, Denver has amended this and said that it actually has to be 24% better than baseline, or 76% of baseline. Then if you follow ASHRAE, there's actually 3 different pathways in ASHRAE if you follow it by the book. I deleted the one pathway that Denver deleted just to not be confused. But really what they say is you can follow prescriptive, or you follow ASHRAE modeling Appendix G, which if you follow the code, it just says it has to be better than baseline. But Denver has amended that, and it says it has to be 15% better than baseline if you're following Appendix G. So just to point out a few changes to the base code that Denver's amended, just on your pathways, you're already starting to see some changes there. Now, the reason for these changes is, like I said, not each pathway is different in terms of energy consumption. So what Denver tried to do in order to try to hit their energy goals was to try to level the playing field. So we don't see any one pathway being more strenuous than the others or harder to get to. So just want to point that out. With Appendix G, I will say that that is probably the most common pathway that I see. It's a modeling pathway. And the reason I see the most of that is a lot of the times people are following a LEED certification. And if they're doing a LEED model, that model can get you some points towards your certification level. And depending on how much percent better you are than code, you can get more points. And that LEED model follows Appendix G. So we see that, quite a bit. And in addition, Xcel Energy's Energy Design Assist, EDA program, also follows ASHRAE 90.1 Appendix G modeling and gives you rebates back based on percentage better than code. So, we tend to see quite a few models following Appendix G just because of all this. Keep that in mind when you're looking at which pathway you want to follow, but that's kind of what we're seeing. So if you're following the IECC performance pathway, here are the mandatory sections. Today we're going to focus mostly on 402, which is your envelope, since this is the architectural section. We'll talk a little bit on 405, which has to do with lighting, only because that has to deal with zones and how you break up the building for lighting controls. And then section 408, which is commissioning. And the reason we're going to cover a little bit on 408 is because of building envelope commissioning, which falls under the architectural section, is required now per the amendment. So those are the sections we're going to follow on that. If you're looking at the prescriptive pathway, the items in red are the new items, enhanced envelope, or, when I said Denver amended this pick one section, you now have to pick two. Well, last code cycle had 6 options to pick from. This code cycle, you have 8 options to pick from. And then with Denver, you have to pick 2 of these 8 to do. And we'll go into more detail on those. All right, so let's jump into it. Let's jump into Windows. We're in climate zone 5 here in Denver. So you can see if you look at the chart, there's different climate zones based on what climate zone you're in. Sometimes Colorado has more than one climate zone, but for City and County Denver, we only have one climate zone, which is climate zone 5. And the little red box there is all that's really changed from 2015 to 2018. So pretty simple change there. I will say Denver, in their amendments, though, did make this a little bit easier to read. So this is what the code shows you, this table. But what Denver did is say, well, let's get rid of all the other climate zones to make this easier for people. We don't want people to be confused. So this is the new table for City and County Denver. They didn't make they didn't make any changes to the table that were different per se than what we pointed out on the last slide. So, they're not doing a bait and switch or anything here, but there were changes from 2015 to 2018. Just so you can see the difference, here's a little chart. Again, the red is what's new. And you can see the difference between 2015 and 2018 IECC. It's just these things in red. And then you can see in ASHRAE, nothing's changed, anything like that. And then Denver, they made one amendment for entrance doors and other fenestrations. So hopefully this slide gives you a little bit of update. I don't think the solar heat gain coefficient is going to be a deal breaker in terms of budget. I think these solar heat gain coefficients were looked at pretty closely to make sure that the industry has these windows and options readily available. It's not per se a premium option because we want to make sure, that if we are going to require somebody to do above and beyond, based on a Denver amendment, we want to make sure that it's the biggest bang for the buck. And so you'll notice that these solar heat gain coefficients are pretty readily available in the market to find. So I'm going to jump back to section 202, a little bit out of order, but it's in order for the presentation on some definitions, just so we're up to speed. So red star asterisk there is Denver amended the definition a little bit here. And what they amended was the language of it. It's basically better define what an above grade wall is. So you can see, so a wall associated with the envelope, 15% or more above grade, and is on the exterior of the building, or any wall that is associated with the building thermal envelope that's not on the exterior of the building. So you can still have a thermal envelope that isn't on the exterior of the building. It could be on the interior of the building. And so we want to make sure that that's captured in above grade wall definition. So what that basically means, above grade walls, and spandrels are now, now our spandrels and things like that, spaces between floors, are considered to be quote unquote above grade walls. So we need to make sure that the insulation values there match what the above grade walls require. So this is a little bit different. If you think about balcony slab edges, those technically would fall into an above grade wall in some situations, which then would need to be insulated somehow. So just know that this definition, changing the definition and being a little bit more clear, adds potential areas that will need to be brought up on an insulation value, an R value level, than you normally would focus on an architectural standpoint. So just keep that in mind. The other definition that I want to go over is Group R, multifamily. So R2 is now considered commercial in the Denver Amendment definition. So just know that no matter the size of multifamily, those are now considered commercial projects and have to follow the commercial provisions of the code in Denver. That's a big change. All right, so let's get back to the envelope and R values and things. So we're looking at, here are your above grade walls, the big table of different climate zones, climate zone 5. Nothing's really changed from the old code to the new code in terms of how much more R value you would need in the wall. Just remember that the definition of above grade walls changed, so some of those locations might need to be brought up to those R values. But the change from 2015 to 2018 is there in that little red box, and that has to do with heated slabs. So again, kind of trying to make this a little bit more simple and easier for everybody to read. You can see the changes from 2015 to 2018, and then the changes, from ASHRAE. And again, nothing's changed from one version to the next except for that heated slab. And Denver's amendments didn't change any of that. Just keep in mind that the areas that might need to be insulated have changed based on the definitions. So heated spaces between slabs and drop ceilings. So, this might be like in a parking garage type scenario, have an amendment to them. So Denver has amended this to add this section to say that if we have a space that we're heating because maybe there's a wet sprinkler pipe in there, so you have a drop ceiling in the parking garage, and that space has to be somewhat heated. And if that space is being heated, we want to make sure that that's within a thermal envelope. Because we're using energy to heat that space, we want to make sure that the envelope is keeping that heat in and thus using less energy. So this is a tricky space, and so Denver has called this section out because of that. It is a tricky spot. So what they're saying is the slab must have a minimum of R5 insulation, and the plenum floor, so if you're drop ceiling tiles, must have a minimum of R19 insulation on top of that. And that will then suffice to be enclosing that that soffit space, that drop ceiling space within the building envelope. So, you know, it's a little bit hard to seal the drop ceilings, but you're more than welcome to make that your building envelope and try to seal that. But Denver's found that, you know, over the years with maintenance going up there and checking things, or people popping their head up, or maybe leaks, that, you know, that envelope kind of gets beat up and not put back in place. So, you know, same thing with some bat insulation that's laying on top of the drop ceiling. But you know, it just needs to be installed there, R5 on the slab, and then R19 on the drop ceiling. So one thing, this is a mechanical section, but it applies to architects because of the radiant floor heating insulation requirement. You know, you might need to accommodate for that. You now need to have R3.5 anywhere you have radiant floor heating. So that might need to be something you incorporate in your plans or when you're planning your drawings. That's why this section is in here. So if you're following the ASHRAE path, no matter if it's Appendix G or prescriptive, you will have to have this in there. Skylights. Skylight curbs before didn't have to be insulated previously, but now because of the above grade wall definition and even the change in the code says they have to be brought up to an R5 on that. So just know that the curbs have to be insulated. And then any shafts that come up through the roof line there would be considered above grade wall, and then have to be brought up to the insulation value of what your wall R value needs to be. So changes to the code, and because of change to the definition of the code, some additional insulation requirements are now required on there. All right, so let's talk about insulation on those walls. So we have our R value. We know what our R value needs to be in our wall insulation. However, in order to try to reduce energy consumption even further, Denver made an amendment on that and to reduce thermal bridging. So if you have thermal bridging, you're allowing heat to transfer from the outside to the inside of the building via metal or wood or studs or some sort of bridge, if you will. And so Denver has amended a section to say if you're using Z-girts, you're going to get penalized a little bit because of thermal bridging. Now, you can not be penalized if you do some certain things, but what they're trying to do is eliminate the thermal bridge. So if you use vertical Z-girts, they're saying that whatever your wall R value is, you're going to decrease that by 40%. And that's going to be your effective R value of that wall. So say the R value of your wall has to be R13. Well, if you have vertical Z-girts, take 40% off that, and now you don't have R13. So effectively, you need to put more than R13 in that wall system to bring your wall system back up to R13. And same thing goes with horizontal Z-girts, except for it's a little bit less of a penalty. Instead of 40%, they're going to say 30% decrease in R value. But if you use intermittent Z-girts, then you don't have any penalty in R value. So when you're doing your design, I would say I would try to stick to intermittent Z-girt connections so you don't have a penalty in your R value. Or the other exception is if your Z-girts don't compress. So basically, if you attach the Z-girts or attach that over your continuous insulation, there's no penalty as long as it doesn't compress the insulation. So if you think about it, we're just trying to get rid of thermal bridging as much as possible when you're doing your insulation on your exterior wall. All right, so we're going to move to, that's basically, in a nutshell, the changes from an envelope standpoint. I will say that it's section 402, the envelope section in the code, is pretty small in comparison to pages, to mechanical or modeling or whatever. But in my opinion, it's the largest effect on our energy consumption and our energy use. And up until recently, people haven't thought about the envelope as being a contributor to energy usage. And so now we're seeing a lot more emphasis on that. Our mechanical systems are getting to a point where, we're getting to as good as efficiency as we can, given the technology, and the incremental steps of increasing efficiency is very small. So our buildings are now, our weakest link in our buildings are our envelope. So our mechanical equipment and energy consumption is only as good as our building envelope. If we're letting all this energy out, this heated and cooled air in and out of our building because our envelope is not airtight or as good as it should be, we're not focusing on the right thing. So I'm glad that the city and county of Denver is stepping up and taking the lead on this to make sure that the building envelope is being addressed. So with that, we're going to jump into some sections here, air leakage sections. Air barrier location, air barrier compliance options, rule of fuel burning appliances, doors and access openings, air intakes. Okay, that's all in the air leakage section. And all of you should be aware of those items with the exception of the 2 red stars. Nothing's changed in the code from the last year from last year to this year, except for the ones with the red asterisks. So if you're already following the code from the previous code cycle to now, you should be good, except for those 2 sections there. And so what we'll do is we'll go through those 2 sections because they're 2 small sections of the whole thing, they're actually quite complex when you're looking at the city and county of Denver's amendments. And so what I'll do is try to give you the English version, if you will, or plain English version of those sections instead of trying to wrap your head around code language and legal language and things like that. So just think of this as maybe the abridged version or SparkNotes version of the code. So let's jump into air barrier compliance options, materials or assemblies. So you have to follow this section no matter what, 402.5, all those 8 options we just talked about, no matter which pathway you go down. So it doesn't matter if you're following IECC or ASHRAE, doesn't matter if you're following prescriptive or performance or Appendix G. City and County of Denver says no matter what, you have to follow what's in here to the T. So this is why we're going to focus on this quite a bit on this presentation. So Denver changed this to say you have to do both, not or, materials or assemblies, and envelope commissioning. So sorry, I should have put that up on the screen. So you have to do materials or assemblies or whole building test. That's the code. Denver changed that. This is, sorry to go back. What Denver changed is to say that this or is no longer an or. You have to do the materials or assemblies and the whole building test. So that's what we're going to look at. So if you look at kind of the difference there, you'll see in the red is what Denver's changed. They also have added a requirement in there. So not only did they change this and, they also added that envelope commissioning needs to happen. So if we go back, This is what the code says, and this is what Denver has amended. So let's take a look at what that means. So materials or assemblies. All right. You have to pick one of these options. Your materials for your air barrier have to meet the ASTM standard, or your assemblies have to meet a testing standard, the ASTM testing standard. So you can pick one or the other. What I see doing from an ease standpoint is if your spec calls out that your air barrier materials are ASTM E2178, you meet this compliance option. From a building performance side, that's probably not the best pathway. I would say the best pathway is knowing that your building is performing these standards. So your assemblies would test that. So your roof-to-wall connection, your window-to-wall connection, those assemblies would be tested and meet a leakage requirement on there. So you have one or two options to do, and those are your two options on that. If we're going back to this slide, materials or assemblies. And you would then have to do a whole building test. So let's go look at what that whole building test looks like. So your whole building test, someone would come in, a third party would come in, or an approved agency, and set up a blower door test to see what kind of leakage the building has. And this would be done after the building envelope is completed. That does no good if you're still missing one window that's not put in or something like that. The whole envelope has to be completed. Now, it doesn't mean you have to have your facade up. You can still do your building envelope test without a facade up. And actually, I would recommend that just because if you don't pass, then you have an opportunity to address and fix that and get your building envelope where it needs to be. So what's that whole building test look like? Basically, you're following another ASTM standard. And that standard says that you're going to pressurize the building to 75 pascals. That might not mean a whole lot to all of us on the phone, but basically that's going to tell us how much leakage is in the building envelope. And so City and County of Denver says that if your building leakage is at or below 0.4 CFM per square foot of envelope area, which is different than your floor square footage, then you have passed the Denver requirement for building testing. You remember we had to do that and building testing option. So that's great. 0.40 is pretty achievable in my mind. I've done lots of building envelope testing, and I would say 0.40 is pretty achievable, especially with what I've seen here in Denver and the construction methods, where our contractors are a lot further ahead of technology and applications than say some other parts of the country. And so I don't think personally that would be too hard to hit. Now that might sound scary if you've never done a building envelope test, but trust me, we'll do a little example here. You'll see that that's going to be pretty easy, or should be pretty easy. And the reason Denver did this, to start tracking what our buildings' performance are doing. Maybe all the new buildings come in and shoot, we're way below 0.40. Okay, well that's great. Well, that's not doing any good for the City and County of Denver if our baseline's below 0.40. So they're going to start ratcheting that down, I'm sure, over the next code cycles on that. All right, so what happens if you're 0.40 or higher? Well, you pass, but you get an asterisk from the city. Don't worry, it doesn't go on your permanent record or anything like that. The city's not trying to bust anybody's chops on this. They're just trying to get everybody on board to to help conserve energy and get to their goals. So they're saying, all right, we're going to let you pass, but you're going to need to do some things. If you exceed that 0.40 CFM per square foot of envelope, you're going to have to do diagnostic testing using either smoke tracer, tracer smoke, or infrared imaging while the test is going along, having that visual inspection. And any leaks that are noted during that time, should be sealed up. If you can seal those areas up without deconstructing, any of the building components, then those leaks need to be, go ahead and address those leaks. That's part of your ASHRAE. Go ahead. You'll pass, but you need to fix some of those items. In addition, your report, your building report needs to have the correction actions taken and submitted to the code official and owner, just so everybody knows what was done, to basically prove that you did something. Oh, yeah, we're over 0.4. Well, no one cares. We still pass. Well, we want to make sure that you did pass. So show me, tell me what you did to correct that items. And then on the next build, maybe you'll learn from those mistakes, and maybe your details on your drawings will get a little bit more detailed, if you will, in those areas to focus on. So if you look at this thermal image here, this is a cool one that I took on the building envelope test I did. This is going up and down here. This is a curtain wall, and this is a slab with carpet over the slab. And this connection is where the metal pan of the curtain wall meets the concrete slab. And you can see this blue washing, if you will, is cold air coming from the outside, which is over here, and this red is inside. So you see, when the blower door was on, it was sucking air from this connection of the wall, the vertical glazing to the concrete slab. And you can see the profile. As the test ran on longer and longer, you can see it washing further and further into the room. It's coldest next to the leakage part, and as it goes into the room deeper, it kind of blends in with the interior temperature. So this is just an example of why it's important for these connection points to be sealed, to have an air barrier on there, and why we're testing them. Okay, so get out your pen and paper. We're going to do an example real quick. I'm going to give you some time. I won't give you much time, but feel free to open up the chat function too. We'll spend maybe 4 or 5 minutes on here. But here's an example just to show you how much leakage 0.4 CFM is on a building, typical building. So what we're going to do is calculate how much air leakage can we have on this example building. So remember, the Denver requirement allows us 0.4 CFM per square foot of envelope area. So go ahead and try and do the math. Once you find out that answer, go ahead and chat it, and then we'll kind of go through this step by step. But here are the parameters. I'll just keep talking while you guys work this out. But it's a 1,000 square foot building. The floor print is 250 foot by 100 foot. We have 12-foot tall ceilings, and it's 4 stories tall. So don't overthink this. We're not trying to be tricky and say, oh yeah, there's space in between floors, or what about the concrete slab, thickness, things like that. So go ahead and it's very straightforward. Go ahead and see what we got. So if you want, we can start with trying to find out the envelope square footage. Let's do the envelope square footage. So we need to calculate how much square footage the envelope pertains. So if you think about that, an envelope of this building, think about a cube. There's 6 sides to the cube. I'm seeing answers come in. Thanks. Keep going. Each side of the cube is part of the square footage of the envelope. So if you take your top, your roof, that is one side of your 6. So you have 25,000 square feet on your top part of the cube. You can do the same thing with your bottom, right? Your bottom is the same, 25,000 square foot. So now let's take a look at the sides. You know, we have the sides 250 foot long. And how high are things? Well, 12 times 4 is 48. So, you know, our sides, we're now having square footage on our sides. You could do the same thing with the other side. So, envelope I came up with as your envelope square footage is 83,600 square feet of envelope. Remember, this is different than your square footage of your building. Great, I'm seeing some answers still come in, that's good. So if you're, you know, if we're doing the math here, this is what we just talked about, right? You know, your base is 250 feet, 500 feet, sides, you know, you add all that up, you know, there's the math. Hopefully my math's correct. I could be wrong, but hopefully we did this correct. So we take our envelope square footage and we multiply it by that 0.40 CFM allowed by the city and county of Denver. And that's the amount of leakage this building is allowed to have. So for those of you that had 33,440 CFM, that is the correct answer. So remember when we were saying, you know, that 0.40 is pretty achievable, and sometimes that scares people. But on this simple building, you know, we're allowed almost 34,000 CFM of leakage. Now, if you put that in perspective, you know, one ton of air conditioning, you know, is roughly 12,000 BTUs, which is anywhere between 4 and 600 CFM. So if you take 600 let's take the big number, let's take 600 CFM, divide it by, you know, 34,000, and that's how much tonnage of cooling that you might be leaking, that you're allowed to leak out of these buildings. So the point here, not to do a whole bunch of math or anything, the point here is this new requirement in Denver is very achievable and should be achieved fairly easy. So how do we know if we're designing our building and it's already, the design itself is too leaky? You know, what if we design our building and say, well, the way we designed it, we know it's going to leak 40,000 CFM. Well, that's not going to pass the test, so we better go back and start looking at what we need to do to change that. And so what is cool is actually there's this cool nifty table and chart in the code book that you can put in your specs, or you know, if you're a building official, have this handy on your desk when you're looking at your drawings for a permit, and do a quick estimation. So what if it was all curtain wall? So remember, our vertical envelope was 33,600 feet, and the code says if you have a curtain wall system, that curtain wall system can't leak more than 0.06 CFM per square foot. So if the spec calls that out to say, oh, we need curtain wall systems to be 0.06 or better, well, you can multiply that by your square foot of curtain wall area and know right off the bat how much your building envelope is going to leak for that. So you can do that with all your assemblies and kind of do a checks and balances before it even goes to the code official to know, or even before it goes to construction, and know if your building is going to be able to pass this envelope test that the city and county of Denver is requiring. So all the tools are there for us to do our best and know, you know, get the building envelope as best as we can and pass this requirement for the city and county of Denver. Okay, great. So we went through the materials or assembly side and the whole building test that has to be done. So now we want to look at this and that the city and county of Denver has added to the requirement, where they now require envelope commissioning. Envelope commissioning is different than your whole building test. Just keep that in mind. Your whole building test is actually testing the performance of your building. Envelope commissioning per the city and county of Denver's amendments is different than that. So we'll go through that. City and County of Denver says envelope commissioning consists of three things. I put four here because they kind of lumped one of the items in with the final report. So they say that a construction document review has to be done. Inspections during the install need to be done. And a final report needs to go to the city. In that final report, you do have to have an issues log with any things you found during the inspection and what corrective actions were taken. That's part of the final report. But it's an important item, so I put that as a separate bullet. But just know if you're reading the code by the book, they will only call out three things. And another thing to point out, they don't call it envelope commissioning, but that's just more common terminology. They call it building thermal envelope performance verification. So just know that more commonly is known as envelope commissioning. Or if you want an acronym, BECX. CX stands for, capital C, lower X, commissioning. So if you think of that, if you already know that one, BECX, so BE is building envelope commissioning, also known as that. So during the construction document review, items, for the building envelope need to be reviewed by design professional or approved agency, and any other supporting data. So if specifications are on there or anything like that, that's part of, your envelope review. So if you look at the drawing there, the blue line is the air barrier that was designed on this particular building. And you can see it's not continuous. A good rule of thumb is if you can use your pencil, put it on the paper, and not lift up your pencil and go around the whole building, your air barrier is continuous. That's a good way. If you lift up your pencil, your air barrier is not continuous. So we want to make sure that the design review shows that. And then where it's not continuous, that's where you're going to start seeing air leakage. And remember where we had to do that performance testing, that whole building test? Well, we're going to see more leakage than what we planned for. We calculated all that out in the drawings and said, all right, if all of our curtain walls are this leaky and our roll-up doors are this leaky, we're going to pass. But if it's not constructed that way and we have these gaps in the air barrier, then your number is going to go up and potentially not pass. So on this example, you can see the red circles are pathways of air leakage. So down here on the bottom, this is like a can light in a soffit. Well, that needs to be gasketed and sealed per the code. And, that's a potential area of air leakage. So go ahead and make sure we have a detail there showing how can lights are supposed to be gasketed and things. We have a gap here from our air barrier. We have air can now come out through here and out your can light, come out here and out your roof penetration. Here you can see in this photo, this is the actual building and how it was built. And remember that requirement in Denver where they say if you don't pass the leakage rate, you have to do some type of tracer smoke or thermal imaging. What you're seeing here is tracer smoke billowing out of the building, in these areas where leakage is coming out. So tracer smoke and thermal imaging will help identify areas where it's leaking. So just kind of know that, these drawing reviews are great. As architects, we all can draw a line and not pick up our pencil. But what we need to remember is how it's being installed in the field. it might be a lot more difficult to install that, that feature or that detail in the field than just what it looks like on paper. So this envelope commissioning hopefully helps catch the differences between what's on the documentation, construction documents, and what's actually being installed in the field. So I think Denver did a good job with including this requirement in their amendments. So how do I know if, you know, commissioning is required? Well, you know, we have several different pathways, right? We talked about that. That's that flexibility. We have the IECC, we have ASHRAE, we have LEED, we have Denver's amendments, things like that. So just know, you know, from a building envelope standpoint, no matter which pathway you go down, either IECC or ASHRAE, Denver says you have to commission it from an envelope standpoint. It doesn't matter on square footage. It doesn't matter on equipment capacity. This is more for your mechanical, electrical, and plumbing items. But what we're interested in from an architect standpoint is the building envelope and commissioning of the building envelope. So Denver is saying that you'll have to commission the building envelope no matter which pathway. You know, and if you're looking at LEED, if your building is following a LEED certification, just because it's going after a building envelope point, that's an optional point. So just because the building's going after a LEED certification doesn't necessarily mean it is meeting the Denver requirement for building envelope commissioning. So it's just something to keep an eye on. All right, so required systems, just a point of reference on what needs to be commissioned. Envelope is one that we're looking at here, so that's why it's in here. But just know there's other systems that need to be required or that need to be commissioned besides the building envelope. That's not always going to be the same commissioning agent or commissioning firm that will do the building envelope commissioning along with the MEP commissioning. Some firms have the capability of doing all of the requirements in-house. Others don't have the ability to do all of it in-house. So just know that just because you're getting a commissioning agent on board, we want to make sure that that commissioning agent is also covering the envelope requirements. All right, so we're back to this section, 402.5. You know, that was a big section there. I said it was going to be a lot. We just went through this air barrier compliance option of, this entire section. That's mandatory. Remember, all of these are mandatory. We're just going over the asterisks because those are the new or the changes to the code. So we've gone through this one, the materials and assemblies. Let's go through the last one here. We're getting close to wrapping up. Then we'll open it up for questions. But the next one are rooms with fuel burning appliances. So this is not new. However, it's been written a little bit clearer in the Denver amendments. And it's more closely related with the building envelope than anything else. So any space that has fuel burning appliances that brings outside air must be located outside the building envelope. So remember, when we're trying to not lift up our pencil, sometimes it's easy just to go on the exterior of the building and encapsulate the entire square or rectangle. If we have a simple square or simple rectangular building. This is a little bit different. So this is saying that we're going to have to go inside the exterior wall and basically create that space outside of the building envelope. It's a little bit, tricky to do. We can, I think this is one of the sections where I would say on paper, super easy to draw, but execution in the field, a lot harder to do. So this is something that I would say from an architect standpoint, you probably want to have a little bit more detail on than others. So and these spaces also they basically just need to be enclosed and isolated from other conditioned spaces. And the idea behind this, if you kind of want to know some of that, is basically if we're bringing in unconditioned air, through a wall louver, that's acting as the fuel or the air for these combustion appliances. We don't want that to be associated with leaky walls or anything like that. If this space here is connected to a conditioned space and an adjacent conditioned space, we then have the potential for air leakage. That's unconditioned air in this space to leak to the adjacent space. So that's kind of the idea behind that. All right, so let's jump into section 405. There's not a whole lot on there. This is electricity. So why do we need to talk about electricity? This is for architects. Well, because of the amendment to the Denver Code, solar readiness needs to be part of your building now. And the reason we're talking about that is because it affects the structural integrity of the building. So the highlighted portions here are probably the areas that we want to focus on from an architect standpoint. We probably don't need to worry about, panel space, electrical panel space, or, complying with the National Electrical Code, the NEC, or anything like that from an architect standpoint. But what we do need to focus on is how much structure or how much load do we need to design for solar readiness, the amendment that Denver has amended. So easy, right? 40% of your roof area has to be solar ready, at least 40%. You have to design that area for a dead load of at least 5 pounds per square foot. You got to put that in your design calculations. And the other thing that's kind of tricky is that you probably want to have something on your drawings, a pathway for your conduit and piping from the zone to the panel. You're going to probably have a roof penetration on there, so we need to have a detail on that. We need to show the pathway on that. The reason there's an asterisk there is Denver has amended that. If you're following the code, it just says you need to have a pathway shown on your drawings. Denver says, nope. Let's go ahead and install that. We want to make it easy for whoever's going to do this solar implementation down the road. We want to make it as easy as possible. Go ahead and install the conduit. So just know that you can't just, you're not just going to be drawing that pathway, a fictitious pathway. It's actually going to have to be installed in there. So from an architectural or structural standpoint, this solar readiness section is an important section and amendment that we all need to follow. So at least 40% of the roof area. Remember, you can do more. You definitely can do more. Okay, so that's the Denver amendments on IECC. This is a cool project. This is actually Google Pearl Place, the project that I did. You can see the solar panels on the roof there. And it's an available roof area. So this is a good aerial view of what that means. Available roof area. So obviously these little dark rectangles here are the solar panels. But you can see here are mechanical penthouses and rooftop units and chillers. Same thing on this side of the building. And then you have a mechanical screen covering that. So your available roof area, you need to have walking pathways, to get to the penthouses. You also need to have so many feet from the parapet or the edge of the roof from a fire safety standpoint standpoint. You all should be familiar with those distances and things and pathways. But in this particular case, this is all the available roof area. So if we look at this into maybe cut the building in half here, maybe half this way, really our available roof area is only half of what the square footage of the roof is. So Denver says 40% of the available roof area. So, if you're, maybe some of this over here was available, that went into the calculation. So you're going to need to do some calculations here of what's available roof area and see how much square footage you need to do. So you could do that calculation, and I would suggest, that needs to be on the plans, I would say, for the code official to review to make sure you're hitting that. All right. Throwing a wrench in there, though. Green Building Ordinance, which we all have to follow anyway, says 70% of the total roof area. So we have a little conflict here between the 40%, between the IECC and the Green Building Ordinance. You either have to do 40% or 70%. Well, if you do the 40%, you may not be meeting the Green Building Ordinance. And what I'm saying there is you may not be, because if you are following this pathway that says, I'm going to do 70% of a total roof area, which is different than available roof area, you might be meeting it, you might not. But there are other pathways to meet the Green Building Ordinance. If you do the combination path, you only need 42% of the total roof area, which again is different than the available roof area, which then could potentially be meeting both the Green Building Ordinance combo path and the IECC ordinance, or amendment, of 40%. So throw a little wrench in there. That's why in the beginning I wanted to talk a little bit about the Green Building Ordinance pathways, because that is very important when you're looking at maybe structural load of your building. Instead of doing 70% of the total roof area, being that 5 pounds per square foot, you might not need to do as much as you thought. So just keep that in mind. All right, this is the last section that I'll cover on lighting, and I'm only covering this because the red is new, and from an architectural standpoint, what I want to focus on are your plans and zones. From a lighting standpoint, we're starting to see, and we all, zone off different compartments and offices and areas like that. But zoning is going to be important to look at from a lighting requirement. You may or may not have a lighting person on board that does your in-house, that does your lighting design. You may have that subbed out, but just know that your lighting zones from an architectural standpoint or a floor plan standpoint will trigger some either additional occupancy sensors or things like that if your zones are larger than you thought. So this 600 square feet or smaller kind of thing, and 300 square feet. So zones can't be larger than 600 square feet. If the new areas, if it's less than 300 square feet, you don't need an occupancy sensor or vacancy sensor, things like that. So probably not something you need to worry about too much if you have a lighting consultant on board. All right, so here we go. This is, like we said, we're wrapping up. Here's that last category, section 406, where it said pick one. Remember, Denver amended this to say pick two. I will say here are the 3 items from an architect standpoint would be of interest per code. This is what the percentages are. So on-site renewable, 3%. So if your project is picking that, shoot, you might already be meeting that with your solar readiness or your Green Building Ordinance. You might already be meeting that, and that might be a freebie. But that's an option. Enhanced envelope performance. That's saying that your envelope, like your R value, your UA value of the building is 15% better than code. So if you pick that option, that might be 15%. And then the last option, which is one of the two new ones for the code. You know, the two red ones are new. It's saying that if your air infiltration is 0.25 CFM per square foot, you meet that requirement. So remember, City and County of Denver said you only need to do 0.40, but if you're lower than that, shoot, that might be a freebie. If you're at 0.21 CFM per square foot, hey, you just got one of your pick two options for free. So, you know, it'll pay to make sure your building envelope is tight. You know, you could potentially have some free options here. So I've just got one more slide after this. This is kind of a recap slide of where we started on the presentation. Remember the different pathways. This is just kind of the base code. These are not what's shown on the screen. These are not the Denver amendments per se. But the last thing that I want to talk about before we open it up for questions is, what does the code official need for a certificate of occupancy? So before final inspection can be called for, the commissioning report has to go to the code official. So you'll see this commissioning compliance checklist. Again, you know, this is also MEP tied into building envelope. Denver has amended this section, or this letter, this checklist, to follow their amendments. It's pretty darn close to what's in the book, but you know, this is an amended checklist for Denver that says, hey, MEP commissioning along with building envelope commissioning has been done. Here's the commissioning report. So you need this compliance checklist, you need the commissioning report, and then that commissioning report needs to have the results of your building envelope testing in there. So just know, before a project can call for final inspection, the code official needs all those documentations, and those usually would come from the commissioning agent. All right, so I'll open it up for questions. I know we finished a little early, but hey, if there's a lot of questions, that'll be great because we have plenty of time for that.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so we can go ahead and you can either unmute your line or write in the chat any questions that you might have. I do have a few questions to start us off here, Kevin. First one is a multi-part question. How does Denver propose we do envelope testing on multifamily units that have exterior doors in every unit? Does the 0.4 CFM per square foot metric still apply, or the old metric of 50 air changes per hour? Is the total envelope or only envelope to the exterior?
Sure, that's a great question, and this came up quite a bit in the code hearings that we heard. Is that residential building envelope testing? You know, and for all practical purposes, we would say multifamily is residential, but we now know that that's considered commercial. Follows things a little bit differently. They talk about air changes per hour instead of CFM per square foot of envelope leakage. And they also test at a different pressure, building pressure. Instead of testing at 75 pascals on the residential side, they usually test at 50 pascals. So what they tried to do, I don't know if it'll come out in supplemental information or not, but as it stands right now in the Denver amendments, it's still talking about CFM per square foot of envelope leakage and not air changes. But what they're trying to do is put both of those values in there so that people who are used to seeing air changes per hour can now start to see what that equates to in CFM per square foot of envelope leakage. So that's to be determined on if, you know, if that comes out. So it's a little bit different. There is a calculation. It's not really a simple one-to-one type conversion on that, but just know that might come out. But you are now equipped with how to calculate leakage per square foot of envelope, so you should be able to start getting used to that. The other question, part of that question is, how do we test those multifamily buildings with all exterior doors? That's a great question too. There is a sampling protocol that you can do for those. You can test the entire structure as one, or you can test a percentage of those units, if you will. And if all those units have passed, then you meet the requirement. So hopefully that answers the two-part question there.
Thanks, Kevin. Got another question for you. Do we need to meet air barrier envelope requirements on a change of use for an existing building?
Sure. Yes and no, or I should say it depends. I would say most of the time it would be no. There will be times that that will be required, and that's if you are exposing the entire envelope and touching the air barrier. Most times you're not going to be exposing the entire envelope and air barrier, so it's going to be rather difficult to get an accurate test result on that. So the City and County of Denver said that will be an exception, but doesn't say that it's never going to be an option, because there could be a case where that comes up where you are affecting and touching the entire building envelope. But more than likely, the testing will not be required in that situation.
Great, thank you. I think we have a follow-up question to the first couple of questions, which is, who's sampling the protocol? ResNet?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I know that 100%. You know, there is a ResNet sampling protocol, but that's definitely from a residential standpoint. You know, if I'm looking at the Denver amendments, you know, it's basically saying that, and I'll just read it out here and hope that this answers the question. And bear with me, because this isn't the Spark Note or, you know, layman's language. This is the code language, but maybe you can interpret that yourself to get the answer. So the testing shall be required on all portions of the building where the following portions of the building are tested and measured air leakage is area weighted by the surface area of the building thermal envelope in each portion of, and there's three of them. One, the entire envelope area of all stories that have any spaces directly under a roof. Two, the entire envelope area of all stories that have a building entrance, exposed floor, loading dock, or are below grade. And three, representative above grade sections of the building totaling at least 25% of the wall area enclosing the remaining conditioned space. So that's your sampling protocol. It's a little bit tricky. It's not following the ResNet protocol by saying, oh, I would test, you know, 7 of 10 units, you know, and if those 7 pass, then I can do 10% or something like that. Totally different. But they do have a sampling protocol listed in there. You might just have to decode that, if you will, to find out what exactly that means. And sorry, I didn't decode that. Maybe I can work on decoding that and making that simpler in a follow-up email.
That would be great. Thanks, Kevin. So you talked about how Denver put in the 0.4 CFM per square foot as one of the amendments. And how hard is that to pass in the building envelope testing?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's fairly easy to pass. You know, I've been doing envelope testing for several years now. I'm following the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers protocol, and their protocol says 0.25 CFM per square foot, not the 0.40. And you know, I think I've only had 2 buildings in my entire career not pass that at 0.25 CFM. So I think that 0.40 CFM is fairly easy to pass. And I think, you know, with the example we did in the presentation, you'll be able to know from just on a paper standpoint if your building is going to pass and by how much. If you do that calculation, you'll see that your building will probably be a lot lower than that 0.4. So I think it'll be pretty easy to pass.
Great. And so then who at the city do the envelope testing results go to then?
Sure. That's a good question. Let me see if Keith is on the line here, and maybe Keith can chime in. Let's see.
Yes, I'm here.
Not to put you on the spot, Keith, but that might not be, you know, you might not be ready to answer that. But I don't know. That's a good question.
Is this with the thermal envelope performance verification? Correct?
Yeah. So I think there's 2 things from an envelope standpoint that need to be reported: the envelope test and then the envelope commissioning report. So I guess I don't know who those go to. Either one of those go to.
Here's what we've got, and we're actually creating an errata for this that won't be out until later this year. But the review of the construction documents, we're asking them to submit a report with the drawings when they come in or review. Mm-hmm. So that'll be reviewed by the architectural plan review team. And then there's the inspection during the construction while it's still open, and then have that report to the inspector, and the final commissioning report will also go to the inspector.
Great.
Thanks,
That's nice. That's good to know.
Well, those are all the questions that I had come in, but Kevin and I will stay on the line for any other questions that do come in for the next few minutes. But otherwise, thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you, Kevin and Christy, for presenting. And hopefully we'll see you next time.
Thanks. I'll hang on the line.